Driving alone through the isolation of a desert highway might sound peaceful, but what would you do if your only chance of help came from someone you couldn't trust? This trucker's chilling encounter will have you gripping your seat until the very end. Driving a truck through long stretches of empty roads has always been my escape. Some folks can't handle the solitude, but for me, it's peaceful, just you, the rig, and the road. At least that's how it usually is. I was driving in the middle of Nevada on a desolate highway. The kind of road where you could go hours without seeing another vehicle, let alone a town. It was close to midnight when I first noticed something off with my rig. The engine made a faint, sputtering noise, barely noticeable at first, but enough to catch my attention. I glanced at the dashboard. No warning lights. Nothing seemed wrong, but the noise persisted, like a faint, regular cough from the engine. I figured I could make it to the next truck stop, which was about 2 hours away. 20 minutes later, the sputtering turned into a full-on stutter. Before I knew it, the engine died. The truck coasted to a slow halt on the side of the road, and the hum of the engine faded into silence. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what just happened. I had maintained my truck religiously, and it had never given me trouble before. Turning the key again, I was met with the awful clicking sound of a dead engine. Frustrated, I flicked on the hazard lights and stepped out of the cab. The desert air hit me like a wall of heat, even though it was past sundown. Desert nights are supposed to be cool, but something about this air felt wrong. I popped the hood, grabbed my flashlight from the toolbox, and shined it over the engine. I'm no mechanic, but everything seemed fine. No leaks, no visible damage. But the truck wasn't going anywhere. I grabbed the CB radio and called out, breaker 1 to 9. Anyone out there? My rig's dead, stuck on the side of the highway. Anyone nearby? Static. I tried again, louder this time, my unease growing. Come on. Someone's got to be out there. I could use some help. Nothing. Just static. I stood there, the quiet pressing in on me. My phone had no signal, and the nearest town was too far to walk. I was stuck in the middle of nowhere. That's when I saw them headlights in the distance, faint but growing closer. Relief flooded through me. Maybe it was another trucker who could help. As the vehicle approached, I saw it was an old, beat-up pickup truck. It rolled to a stop a few yards ahead of my rig, and a man stepped out. He was tall and lanky, his clothes worn and dusty, like he'd been on the road for days. Something about him immediately put me on edge. "You need some help?" he asked, his voice gravelly and low. For a second, I didn't know how to respond. Something about him felt off. But what choice did I have? I was stranded, and he was the only person around. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "My truck broke down. Not sure what the problem is. It just died." He nodded slowly, his eyes flicking toward my rig. "Mind if I take a look?" I hesitated but finally said, "Sure, go ahead." He walked over to the truck with a strange, deliberate slowness. My unease grew as I watched him. He didn't ask questions or look too closely at the engine. He just stood there, peering under the hood, his back to me. The whole situation felt wrong, like I was missing something obvious. "See anything wrong?" I asked, breaking the silence. He didn't respond at first. Then he turned to face me, his eyes cold and calculating. "Looks like you're in a bit of trouble," he said, his voice almost amused. "But I can help. There's a place not far from here, just off the highway. Got some tools there. We can tow your rig and get you fixed up." My gut was screaming at me to refuse. Something in his voice, and the way he looked at me felt wrong. I appreciate the offer, but I think I'll just wait for a tow. Shouldn't be too long before someone comes by. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. "You sure?" he asked, taking a step closer. "It's a long way to the next town. Could be hours before anyone else comes through." I forced a smile. "I'm sure. Thanks for stopping, though." He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked back to his truck. But he didn't drive away. He just sat there, his engine idling. I climbed back into my cab and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I tried to steady my breathing. The man's truck hadn't moved. He was still sitting there waiting. I tried to tell myself it was fine, that he'd leave soon, but the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Minutes passed, then an hour. The man's truck still hadn't moved. Suddenly his truck lurched forward, pulling up alongside my rig. My stomach twisted with dread as I saw his silhouette through the window, his face illuminated by the dim glow of his dashboard lights. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. He rolled down his window and leaned out. "You sure you don't want that help, buddy?" My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't answer. Instead, I reached for my phone, praying for a signal. Nothing. The man got out of his truck and started walking toward my door. My hands fumbled for the keys, desperately trying to start the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. Panic surged inside me as he knocked on the door, his voice low and menacing. "Open up. Let's have a talk." I gripped the tire iron under my seat, ready to defend myself if he tried to get in. But just as he reached for the door handle, I heard another engine. Headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, cutting through the darkness. Another truck was approaching. The man froze, his hand still on the door handle. He glanced over his shoulder at the approaching vehicle, then turned and walked back to his truck. Without another word, he climbed in and sped off into the night. The other trucker pulled up behind me. I was too shaken to get out at first, but eventually forced myself to step out and wave him down. When I told him what happened, he stayed with me until a tow truck arrived. That night was the closest I've ever come to real danger on the road. I still drive trucks, but whenever I'm on a deserted stretch of highway, I keep my eyes on the road and never, ever stop for strangers. Sometimes the people who offer help are the ones you need to fear the most. Late-night truck stops might seem like a safe haven, but one restless driver discovers a terrifying truth sometimes. The scariest things aren't in your imagination. Stick around as this chilling encounter will leave you questioning every stop you make. I've been a long-haul trucker for years, and I've seen my fair share of eerie moments on the road. But nothing, and I mean nothing, comes close to what happened to me at a deserted rest stop one night. It was late October, and I was hauling a load from Arizona to Georgia. I'd been driving for nearly 11 hours straight and could feel the exhaustion setting in. My eyelids were heavy, and I knew I needed to pull over before I risked falling asleep at the wheel. The highway was empty, the kind of stretch where there's nothing but darkness and the hum of your engine to keep you company. Then I saw a sign for a rest stop, just 2 miles ahead. Perfect timing, I thought. I slowed down, exited the highway, and pulled into the lot. The place was practically abandoned. 2 other trucks were parked at the far end, their cabs dark and lifeless. There wasn't another soul in sight. The rest stop itself was unimpressive: a few parking spaces, some rundown picnic tables, and an old restroom building that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. A single flickering street lamp cast long, eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. I parked my rig in the middle of the lot, not too close to the other trucks, but not too far either. Something about the isolation didn't sit right with me, but I chalked it up to being tired. I cut the engine and sat there for a minute, letting the silence of the desert settle around me. It was unnervingly quiet. No wind, no crickets, just dead, suffocating silence. Grabbing my thermos, I took a long swig of coffee, hoping it would shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It didn't. After a few minutes, I decided to stretch my legs and use the restroom before settling in for some sleep. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the cab. The night air was cold, and the ground crunched under my boots as I walked toward the restroom building. The restroom was in worse shape than I expected. The door hung slightly off its hinges, and graffiti covered the walls. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit me first musty, damp, and foul, like the place hadn't been cleaned in years. I flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. Sighing, I aimed my flashlight around the cracked tiles and peeling paint, searching for the least disgusting stall to use. As I was finishing up, I heard footsteps. Soft at first, then louder, like someone was walking slowly around the building, circling it. I froze. The rest stop had been empty when I arrived. No cars had pulled in, and the trucks at the far end were still dark and silent. So who the hell was out there? Quickly, I finished and stepped out of the stall. I listened carefully, straining to hear, but the footsteps had stopped. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the wind or an animal. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and shone my flashlight around the lot. Nothing. Just the same eerie silence and the flickering street lamp in the distance. I shook off the uneasy feeling and made my way back to my truck. Halfway there, I saw him, a man standing by one of the picnic tables. He was barely visible in the dark, his hands stuffed into the pockets of a heavy jacket, his face obscured by a hood. My heart skipped a beat. He hadn't been there when I'd arrived. I was sure of it. I stopped in my tracks, my flashlight trained on him. He didn't move. He just stood there, completely still. I couldn't make out his face, but something about his posture, the way he stood there, like he was waiting for something, made my skin crawl. Forcing myself to stay calm, I resumed walking, keeping my eyes on him as I got closer to my truck. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was gone. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was nothing, just some guy passing through, another trucker maybe. But if that was the case, why hadn't I seen or heard him pull in? Lying down in the bed at the back of the cabin, I turned off the interior light and tried to relax. But the unease I felt earlier only grew worse. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the man by the picnic table, standing there, watching me. I don't know how long I lay there, but it must have been close to an hour when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were right outside my truck. I shot up, grabbing my flashlight, and shined it through the window. No one was there, just the empty parking lot and the flickering street lamp. Then came the knock. Soft at first, almost polite, like someone tapping gently on the door. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I leaned forward, trying to peer through the window without making it obvious, but I couldn't see anyone. Then I heard another knock, this time from the other side of the cab. My heart pounded as I realized there wasn't just one person out there. There were at least two. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911, but there was no signal, Of course there wasn't. The knocking grew more aggressive, like whoever was out there wasn't just messing with me. They wanted in. I debated getting out, trying to scare them off, but something told me that was a bad idea. Instead, I slammed my fist against the horn. The loud blare echoed through the empty rest stop, and for a moment the knocking stopped. I waited, listening for any sign of movement. Then I heard a car engine. Headlights cut through the darkness as another vehicle pulled into the lot, its bright beams illuminating the shadows around my truck. That's when I saw them. 3 figures scattered around my rig, all wearing dark clothes, their faces hidden by hoods. When the car's lights hit them, they froze. Then, as if on cue, they bolted, disappearing into the desert. I didn't waste any time. I turned the key, started the engine, and peeled out of that rest stop as fast as I could. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I reached a well-lit truck stop a few hours later. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I couldn't stop thinking about the figures knocking on my doors. When I told a few other truckers what had happened, one of them mentioned rumors about that rest stop. Apparently, people had gone missing there. Trucks were found abandoned, but there was never any proof, just stories. I never stop at remote rest stops anymore. You never know who or what might be waiting for you in the dark. What would you do if you realized something was following you on a deserted highway, but every attempt to escape only made it worse? This driver's terrifying ordeal will keep you on the edge of your seat till the very end. I've been a trucker for over 20 years, and I've seen some strange things out on the road. Long stretches of highway at night can play tricks on your mind. Shadows seem to move, and your tired eyes can blur reality. But nothing I've experienced compares to what happened one late November night in Texas. It was a remote highway cutting through miles of empty desert. The road was as straight as an arrow, with no towns, no gas stations, and no rest stops for miles, just endless darkness. Normally, I didn't mind the solitude, it gave me time to think. But that night, something felt off. The air was heavy, pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My headlights lit up the cracked asphalt ahead, but beyond that, there was nothing but blackness. I checked the clock on my dashboard. It was 11:47 p.m. I still had hours to go before I planned to pull over for the night. After about an hour of driving, I noticed a car in my rearview mirror. At first, it was just a pair of headlights far in the distance. I didn't think much of it. It's rare to see other vehicles on roads like these at this time of night, but it's not unheard of. Maybe another trucker or someone driving cross-country. I kept an eye on it, a habit I've picked up over the years. Knowing what's behind you is just as important as watching the road ahead. But the car didn't seem to be gaining on me. It stayed back, keeping the same distance. After 20 minutes of this, I started to feel uneasy. I was driving at a steady pace, about 65 miles per hour. Any car should have caught up by now, or at least gotten closer. But this one stayed exactly where it was. I told myself it was nothing, just a coincidence. Maybe the driver was cautious or nervous about passing a big rig at night. Still, I couldn't shake the discomfort growing in the pit of my stomach. My palms were starting to sweat. I kept glancing at the mirror, waiting for the car to either speed up or fall behind, but it didn't. Another 30 minutes passed, and the car hadn't budged. My focus on the road wavered as I kept checking the mirror. My heart started beating faster, even though nothing had really happened yet. But something deep down told me this wasn't normal. This wasn't just some guy driving through the desert at night. Something was wrong. I decided to slow down and let the car pass me. Maybe this would force the driver to reveal their intentions. I eased off the gas, watching the headlights in the mirror, expecting them to get closer. But they didn't. I slowed down more, down to 50 miles per hour, then 40. The car stayed exactly where it was, not gaining, not falling behind. Now I was getting nervous. This wasn't possible. I slowed down even more until I was crawling at 30 miles per hour. Still, the headlights remained the same distance away. My stomach twisted into knots. Finally, I pressed the brakes, bringing my truck to a complete stop in the middle of the road. I stared into the rearview mirror, waiting for the car to catch up. But when I looked again, it was gone. The road behind me was empty. No headlights, no car, just darkness stretching out for miles. I squinted into the mirror, trying to see if the car had turned off somewhere, but there were no exits, no turnoffs, no way for it to disappear. A chill ran down my spine. I knew I hadn't imagined it. That car was there, and now it wasn't. I threw the truck into gear and started moving again, faster this time. My hands were slick with sweat, gripping the wheel tightly. My mind raced, trying to come up with explanations. Maybe the driver had turned off their lights or pulled over. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. 15 minutes later, the headlights reappeared in my mirror. My stomach dropped. The car was back. Same distance, same exact spot in the mirror. It was like nothing had happened, like it had never disappeared at all. Panic surged through me. My hands trembled on the wheel as I tried to steady my breathing. I didn't know what to do. Stopping hadn't worked, and speeding up didn't seem to make a difference. The car just stayed there, following me like a predator stalking its prey. Then it started moving. Slowly at first, but then picking up speed. My heart slammed against my ribs as I watched it approach. It wasn't swerving or flashing its lights. It was coming straight for me, steady and fast. I floored it, speeding down the highway at 70, then 80 miles per hour. But no matter how fast I went, the car kept gaining on me. The headlights filled my rearview mirror, so bright I had to squint to see the road ahead. Then it was right on me, so close I could almost make out the shape of it in my mirrors. My breath hitched. I couldn't think. I just knew I had to get away. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the car veered off into the darkness and disappeared from my mirror. I didn't stop until I reached the next gas station, a small, rundown place that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. But I didn't care. I pulled into the lot, jumped out of my truck, and ran inside, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. The attendant looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I just needed to be around people, to feel like I wasn't alone anymore. After a few minutes of pacing, I told the attendant what had happened. He shrugged and gave me a knowing look. "You're not the first trucker to see something strange on that road," he said. "It happens more than you'd think. Some folks say there's a haunted car out there that follows drivers, but it never does anything, just scares the hell out of you." Haunted. That couldn't be it. But then again, I couldn't explain what had happened either. I stayed at that gas station for over an hour, long enough for my hands to stop shaking and my heart to settle. Eventually, I forced myself back into my truck and kept driving. But I haven't taken that route since. I avoid it like the plague. Because no matter how much I try to convince myself it was just my imagination, there's a part of me that knows it wasn't. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't normal. and I'm not sticking around to find out what happens if it catches you. Driving through the foggy mountains at night is unnerving enough, but when whispers echo and the silence and shadows move where they shouldn't, you'll wish you had never taken the route. This trucker's terrifying night in the Appalachians will keep you hooked until the very end. I like to think of myself as a practical person. When you've been a long-haul trucker for as many years as I have, you get used to facing things head-on: flat tires, bad weather, endless nights on empty highways. But there was one night, one stretch of road that still haunts me to this day. It was about 6 years ago, and I was driving through the Appalachian Mountains. I had been on the road for hours, hauling a late-night load from North Carolina up into West Virginia. The job was simple: pick up the cargo, drive through the mountains, and deliver by morning. I'd done this route a dozen times before, and I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. But that night something felt different. The weather had taken a turn for the worse earlier in the evening. A thick fog rolled in, the kind that clings to the ground and makes it feel like you're driving through a dream or a nightmare. My headlights cut through the mist, but barely. Visibility was terrible. I could only see a few feet ahead of me. The winding road disappeared into the fog, making it feel like it was leading me somewhere I wasn't supposed to go. Still, I pressed on. I had a delivery window to meet, and I wasn't about to let a little fog slow me down. I tried to focus on the road, but the silence felt oppressive. It wasn't just the lack of sound, it was the way the fog seemed to swallow everything around me, leaving me completely isolated. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I first heard it, a whisper, so soft it almost blended with the sound of my truck's engine. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Long hours on the road can mess with your head, making you hear and see things that aren't really there. But the whisper didn't go away. I turned my head slightly, listening, trying to make out the sound. It was faint, like someone murmuring right behind me. I glanced into the back of the cab, but of course there was no one there. Shaking my head, I told myself I was just tired, that I needed a break. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The whisper wasn't in my head. It was like it was inside the truck with me, slipping through the cracks of my sanity. I turned up the heat, hoping the warmth would wake me up a bit. The fog outside was as thick as ever, and I couldn't afford to let my mind wander. But the whisper didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was cold, almost angry. My skin prickled with unease. About an hour later, things got worse. I was rounding a sharp curve when I caught movement in my rearview mirror. Just a flicker of something, a shadow disappearing into the fog behind me. My heart jumped into my throat. For a moment, I thought it was an animal or another vehicle, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. Just the road stretching behind me, empty and swallowed by the mist. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. You're seeing things, I told myself. You're tired, and the fog's playing tricks on your eyes. But the explanation didn't sit right with me. The shadow had been too distinct, too human. By the time 4 a.m. rolled around, I was a mess of nerves. The whispering hadn't stopped, and the shadows in my mirror had become more frequent. Every time I looked back, I saw something. Just for a split second, a figure standing in the fog, watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone. I was starting to think I was losing my mind. Maybe the isolation was getting to me. Maybe the fog, the late hour, and the stress of the job were pushing me to the edge. But then something happened that I couldn't explain away. I was driving down a long stretch of road, the fog so thick I could barely see past the hood of my truck. The whispering had grown louder, almost frantic, but I still couldn't make out the words. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see another shadow when I saw a face. I slammed on the brakes, my truck screeching to a stop in the middle of the road. My chest tightened as I stared at the mirror, struggling to catch my breath. There, in the back seat of my cab, was a face. Pale, expressionless, and cold. It stared at me through the reflection, its eyes dark and hollow. Terror gripped me, freezing me in place. I whipped around, expecting no, dreading to see someone sitting behind me. But the back seat was empty. I sat there for a moment, my heart thundering in my ears, trying to process what I had just seen. There was no way someone could have gotten in the truck without me noticing. No way they could just disappear like that. I forced myself to breathe, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't want to look in the mirror again. I didn't want to see that face. But I had to know. Slowly I looked up at the rearview mirror. Nothing. Just the back seat, empty as ever. But that didn't make me feel any better. I could still feel it. Whatever it was lingering in the cab with me, watching, waiting. I needed to get out of there. I needed to keep driving to put as many miles between me and this cursed road as possible. I started the truck again, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, refusing to look in the mirror, no matter how much I wanted to. The fog was still thick, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from whatever had found me in the mountains. Then, the radio crackled to life. At first, I thought it was just static, but as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't. There was a voice in the static, distorted and faint, like someone was trying to speak to me from miles away. And they were saying my name. "Mark," the voice whispered. I froze. The voice was low, guttural, like it was coming from deep within the earth. I reached out to turn off the radio, but before I could, the voice spoke again. "Mark, don't look back." I yanked my hand away from the dial. I felt like I was going to be sick. The voice was still there, repeating the same phrase over and over again, each time growing louder, more desperate. "Don't look back." I didn't want to. I knew that if I looked in the mirror again, I'd see something I couldn't unsee. But the voice, it was compelling me, pulling me toward the rear view, daring me to defy its warning. My hand trembled as I reached up, my fingers brushing the edge of the mirror. I had to know. I had to see. Slowly I adjusted the mirror just enough to catch a glimpse of the back seat. And there it was again. The face, just staring at me. I slammed the mirror back into place and floored the gas pedal, speeding down the fog-covered road at a dangerous pace. But I didn't care. I needed to get away. The voice on the radio grew louder now, a cacophony of distorted sounds, all screaming the same thing: "Don't look back." I didn't dare. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, even as I felt the cold presence in the cab grow stronger, as if the face was moving closer, inching toward me. My hands shook so badly I could barely control the wheel. Finally, the fog lifted. The radio went silent. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. Pulling into a diner parking lot, I cut the engine and sat there for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? A ghostly face in my rearview mirror. A voice warning me not to look back. It sounded insane, even to me. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And to this day, I haven't driven through those mountains again. No matter how much time passes, I can't forget that face. I can't forget the way it stared at me. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone on the road, I still hear the whisper, "Don't look back." And I never do. Imagine cruising down a lonely highway, surrounded by silence, only to find your radio crackling with a stranger's voice, a voice that knows everything about you. What would you do? One of the first things I learned as a trucker is that you can't always count on cell service. Whether it's due to bad weather knocking out towers or simply being in a remote part of the country with spotty coverage, something can always go wrong. That's why trucks are equipped with state-of-the-art radio systems, a lifeline for communicating with other drivers and getting help in emergencies. But what happens when that lifeline becomes the danger itself? I was driving through Nebraska on a small, desolate highway. It was around 6 p.m., and the sun was just beginning to set. The rhythmic rumble of my truck's engine filled the cabin, and my mind wandered as I drove. I decided to pull over for a short break, grab a quick meal, and call my wife. The moment I tried dialing, I realized I had no cell reception. Frustrated but not surprised, I sent a text, figuring it would go through once I was back in range. I then unwrapped the sandwich I'd picked up earlier and gazed out at the growing darkness. The landscape seemed eerily still. The air in the cab suddenly felt colder, sending a chill down my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as unease crept over me. What's going on? I wondered, scanning my surroundings. It was hard to see anything beyond the faint glow of my truck's headlights. Shaking off the feeling, I finished my meal and decided to get back on the road. Barely 2 minutes after pulling out, my truck's CB radio clicked. Someone was trying to patch through. I grabbed the microphone. "This is Charlie 42. Who's calling?" Before I could say more, a chilling voice interrupted me. "Where are you going?" The tone was low and unfamiliar. It definitely wasn't anyone from my company. "Who is this?" I demanded. Silence. "Pender." I tried to brush it off as a prank, but a minute later, the voice returned. "I still see you." My grip on the steering wheel tightened as my mind raced for an explanation. I glanced in my mirrors, scanning for headlights or any signs of another vehicle, but the road was empty. My stomach twisted as the voice continued. "You're in a cherry red Mack truck, carrying lumber to Bayside Freight Yard." My blood ran cold. Whoever it was even recited my license plate number. Heart pounding, I checked the mirrors again. Nothing. The isolation of the highway seemed suffocating. I glanced at my phone on the dashboard, but with no signal, it was useless. "Why are you running?" the voice mocked, as though reading my thoughts. "You can't escape me." My palms grew sweaty as I struggled to maintain my composure. 20 agonizing minutes crawled by. The radio stayed silent during that time, and I began to think the ordeal was over. My nerves were starting to settle, until the CB radio clicked once more. "That was fun," the voice said, unnervingly calm. "Until we meet again." Static filled the radio before it went dead. At that moment, my phone buzzed. Service was back. I immediately called my boss, explaining what had just happened. She assured me that no one at the warehouse would pull such a stunt, leaving both of us baffled. To this day, I have no idea how someone got onto my radio frequency or knew so much about me and my truck. The only thing that keeps me from losing my nerve on the road is convincing myself it was just a prank, but deep down I know the truth. It wasn't just a prank. It was something worse. When a peaceful family camping trip takes a chilling turn, you'll be gripping your seat. What would you do if the wilderness held more than just trees and stars? Last weekend, my wife, our 6-year-old son, and I decided to go camping in the forest. It was supposed to be a fun way for our son to explore nature and for us to enjoy some family time. The drive to the campsite was about 2 hours, and we arrived just before sunset. We set up our tent, lit a small campfire, and spent the evening telling stories and roasting marshmallows. Our son was overjoyed by the adventure. As night fell, the forest grew eerily quiet. The only sounds were the crackling campfire and the occasional rustling of leaves. It felt like we were completely alone. No other campers were anywhere nearby. My wife and I felt a bit uneasy, but we didn't want our son to notice. Around midnight, we put out the fire and settled into the tent. Our son, tired from a day of running around, fell asleep almost immediately. My wife and I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the forest. That's when we heard a low, guttural growling coming from the darkness outside. It wasn't the kind of sound you'd expect from a small animal. It was deep and menacing. I reached for the flashlight and cautiously unzipped the tent. The growling grew louder, sending chills down my spine. My wife clutched our son tightly, trying to keep him calm. I stepped outside, my heart pounding, and shone the flashlight around. Suddenly, a pair of glowing eyes reflected back at me from the bushes. They were fixed on me, unblinking. I quickly retreated into the tent, zipping it up tightly. My wife whispered, "What was it?" Her voice was shaky. "I don't know," I replied, "but it's big." We decided to stay inside the tent, hoping the creature would leave. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the growling moved closer, then faded, only to return again. My wife and I sat frozen, barely daring to breathe. The sounds eventually stopped, and silence fell over the forest again. We waited for what seemed like an eternity before peeking outside. The forest was pitch dark, the ominous presence gone. Relieved but still shaken, we stayed awake for the rest of the night, too scared to sleep. The next morning, we packed up and left as soon as the sun came up. Our son, blissfully unaware, thought it was all part of the adventure. But for my wife and me, it was a night we'd never forget. What would you do if a voice from your truck's radio knew everything about you, but you were completely alone on a deserted highway? Stay tuned to uncover the chilling truth. One of the first things I learned as a trucker is that you can't always rely on cell service. Whether it's due to bad weather or being in a remote area with spotty reception, things can go wrong. That's why trucks are equipped with state-of-the-art radio systems to communicate with other drivers and anyone else we might need to contact in an emergency. But what happens when that very system causes the emergency? I was driving through Nebraska on a small highway in the middle of nowhere. It was around 6 p.m., and the sun was just starting to set. The rumbling of the engine filled the air as I let my mind drift. I decided to pull over for a quick meal and to call my wife before getting back on the road. The only problem was that I had no cell reception. Thinking she'd get my message later, I texted her anyway, then started eating the sandwich I'd picked up earlier that day. As the sky grew darker, I noticed how little I could see outside. Suddenly, a chill crept up my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a strange unease settled over me. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was nothing, but I decided to turn on my headlights just to be safe. The lights revealed nothing unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I finished my meal quickly and got back on the road. No more than 2 minutes later, I heard the unmistakable click of my truck's CB radio. It sounded as if someone was trying to contact me. Curious, I picked up the microphone. Before I could say anything, a voice came through, low and menacing. "Where are you going?" I froze. The voice was unfamiliar, and it wasn't anyone from my company. I asked who it was, but all I got in response was silence. Brushing it off as a prank, I kept driving. Then, a minute later, the voice came through again. "I still see you." My grip on the steering wheel tightened as my mind raced for an explanation. My eyes darted to the mirrors, scanning for any signs of another vehicle, but the road was empty. That's when the voice started describing my truck in detail. "You're driving a cherry red Mack truck, carrying lumber to the Bayside freight yard," the voice said. Then it added my license plate number. A wave of terror washed over me. How did this person know so much about me? I looked around frantically, but the highway was deserted. My phone sat uselessly on the dashboard with no service. Even if I wanted to call for help, I couldn't. Trying to stay calm, I focused on driving. Unintentionally, I began speeding up, my nerves getting the better of me. The voice noticed. "Why are you running? You don't think you can escape me, do you?" Sweat dripped from my palms as I gripped the wheel tighter. Minutes passed, and the voice went silent. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then, the CB radio clicked again. "That was a fun time, wasn't it? Until we speak again," the voice said calmly before the line went dead. As soon as the static faded, I noticed my phone signal had returned. I immediately called my boss and reported what had happened. She was as baffled as I was. To this day, I have no idea how that voice got onto my frequency or knew so much about my truck. The only thing that keeps me from losing my mind is the hope that it was just some prankster. But deep down, I know there's no logical explanation for what happened that night. Lonely roads at night are nothing new for Jeb Wilcox, a seasoned trucker used to the solitude of his trade. But when an eerie encounter on a desolate mountain pass takes a sinister turn, he realizes that some shortcuts come at a price. Will he outsmart the predator stalking him, or is he destined to become another ghost story told by truckers? The sky was dark, a deep blue that only appears right before dawn. I've driven trucks for nearly 2 decades and seen every color the sky can throw at you. But that night, something felt off. It was supposed to be just another job moving a load of timber from northern Idaho down to Wyoming. The roads were empty, as they usually are at this hour, and the trees flanked me on either side, their dark silhouettes a constant companion on this lonely stretch of road. I go by Jeb Wilcox. I've been hauling freight across the country since I could legally drive. Life before that wasn't so pretty. I lost both parents young, shuffled through a few foster homes, and found solace on the open road. It's where I belong, where I feel free. But that night, freedom felt more like isolation, and isolation felt like a trap. The route I was on wasn't one I took often. It cut through a lesser-known pass in the mountains, a shortcut, if you knew how to handle the tight turns and steep inclines. It's the kind of road where a slip in concentration could send you barreling down into the trees below. But I liked the challenge. It kept me sharp. About halfway through the pass, I saw headlights in the distance. It was unusual. This wasn't a route frequented by anyone, unless they were trying to shave off a few hours. The lights were bright, piercing through the dark, growing larger as they approached. My mind told me it was another trucker, someone who knew this road like I did. But as the vehicle got closer, I realized it wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was speeding up. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white. The oncoming truck was an old model, probably from the 70s. Its rusted body barely held together by mismatched parts. The driver's face was obscured in shadow, but I could see his outline tall, broad-shouldered, sitting bolt upright. He was driving on the wrong side of the road, straight at me. I laid on the horn, trying to get his attention, but he didn't flinch. At the last second, I swerved to the right, my tires skidding against gravel as the truck flew past me. For a moment, everything was still. I was left with nothing but the sound of my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Then, in my mirror, I saw the truck make a hard U-turn. My stomach dropped. He was following me. I pushed my rig harder than I ever had before, the engine roaring as I sped down the mountain pass. But no matter how fast I went, those headlights stayed close, unwavering. Whoever was driving knew these roads as well as I did, maybe better. Adrenaline surged through me as I took the curves tighter, not caring if the load shifted dangerously in the back. It didn't matter if I lost the timber. It only mattered that I lost him. Every time I thought I'd gained some ground, he'd appear again closer and closer. Finally, I reached a straight stretch of road, one of the few on this godforsaken route. I pushed the pedal to the floor, feeling the truck shudder under the strain. The trees blurred into dark smears on either side, but the headlights still stayed behind me, a relentless predator. Up ahead, I saw the faint glow of a gas station's lights. It was one of those 24-hour joints that service truckers on long hauls, the kind of place that offers stale coffee and greasy burgers. But right then, it was civilization, and that was what I needed. I barreled into the lot, my tires screeching as I brought the truck to a halt. The old truck pulled in right behind me. I jumped out, leaving the engine running, and ran toward the gas station. My heart pounded in my chest as I heard the heavy boots of the other driver hitting the pavement behind me. The place was nearly empty, just a clerk behind the counter and a couple of long-haul drivers nursing their coffees. The door chimed as I burst in, and the drivers looked up, their tired eyes widening as they took in the panic on my face. "There's a guy following me," I shouted, my voice strained. "He's outside right now." The clerk, a middle-aged man with a paunch, looked at me skeptically. "You sure, buddy? Ain't nobody come in behind you?" I whipped around, expecting to see the man in the doorway, but there was no one there. I could see my truck through the glass, but the old rusted one that had been tailing me was gone. I didn't understand. I was sure he was right behind me. I ran to the door, peering into the darkness, but the night was silent, save for the hum of the neon lights overhead. The drivers exchanged glances, probably thinking I'd lost my mind, but I knew what I'd seen. I paced back and forth, my mind racing. Had he driven off? Was he waiting out there somewhere? The thought of going back out alone made my skin crawl, but I couldn't stay in the gas station forever. I needed to keep moving to finish my route. I forced myself to calm down, bought a cup of bitter coffee, and walked back outside. My truck was the only one there, no sign of the other vehicle, no sign of the man. I checked my trailer, making sure everything was secure, then climbed back into the cab, locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a long moment, trying to convince myself it was over, that I was safe. But as I pulled out of the lot and back onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow, every movement in the corner of my eye made me jump. My hands were still shaking as I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. The rest of the drive was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting those headlights to appear again. But they never did.